Welcome to week 5. This week we're going to talk about probability distributions, all kinds of things relating to probability distributions. But first, a couple of housekeeping items. I have extended the deadlines for all of the Chapter 5 pretest review and post-tests. If you didn't catch it last week, I have changed the setting on the post-tests to basically allow for up to 3 attempts. So I had unlimited, and then I changed it this year, and a student asked a question, and it was a very good question, actually, um, about, what it says in the syllabus versus what the Pearson quizzes were set at. So I started to think about that, and I thought that was good logic in the first place, but maybe not unlimited. So I went back through the data, and sure enough, there were very few people, if any, who went beyond 2 attempts. In fact, most of the people had 2 or 3 attempts. There was one person who always had more than 5 attempts. So, if I looked at the data, 3 attempts seemed to be a rational decision, and perhaps even one more than you needed. So I will also apologize for my dog back here tap dancing through the house. So occasionally we have those kinds of things, and we can deal with it. All right, so let's see, that happened. And if you have any questions about deadlines or anything, keep putting them on the FAQs. I caught up on everything this morning as I put out there in the announcement. So everybody should have what they need at least to go forward. So this week I'm only going to cover chapter 6 because you have your midterm that's due, and I'm just going to write my note right now to extend that deadline through the weekend. I'm not really sure why I had everything due on Friday. I also answered a question or questions on the FAQs relating to an absence of data. So this is all part of the experience. I addressed that in the video that I forgot to release. I moved it, and I didn't include the link, so I'll apologize for that. But in the video, I explain, when I looked at the data, this is what I found in my instance when I looked at where I grew up and all those things. So let's get into just a high-level overview of Chapter 6, where we're going to talk about normal probability distribution. So under this heading of normal probability distributions, you're going to have what we would call a standard normal distribution, and then you're going to learn how to apply normal distributions. In other words, that's great, they're nice to know about, but what do we do with it? And then a little bit later on in the chapter, we talk about sampling distributions and estimators, along with the central limit theorem. So these are things that my kid, who's now in 8th grade, learned when he was in, I don't know, 5th or 6th grade, something like that. It's not math, it's something different, and that's why we call it statistics. So when we start to graphically display things, I think it makes a whole lot of sense for people, whereas if they're just trying to read numbers or just descriptive statistics, it becomes kind of difficult after a while, because the brain gets saturated converting those things into pictures. So why not use the pictures from the beginning? So later on, after the central limit theorem, we're going to talk about normal and assessing normality. It's not exactly an existential question, but what is normal? That whole thing. I have no illusions that I'm anything even remotely close to normal. I guess I'm okay with that, because my normal is my normal. So your normal is your normal too. So hopefully it's a happy normal. And I think, when I just use that very simple analogy that I might, use with the kid, what is normal? Well, it's your happy normal. It's the place where, you're kind of centered. You feel like everything is, for the most part, in balance, and, it's a pretty nice day. So that is what I'm talking about in terms of normal. And we can see these things kind of graphed when we have distribution plots that we can look at, and we can depict those in a couple of different ways. So, when we think about the standard normal distribution, it's going to be bell-shaped, and the mean is going to be equal to 0. So, just picture that zero line, that vertical zero line slicing right down through the middle. And then you have a standard normal deviation, which is equal to 1. So it can be 1 for a standard normal distribution, but if you have something outside of that, it may change, okay? So just kind of go with that. When we talk about uniform distributions, basically we're talking about things that are just, kind of distributed in the way that we would expect across a range of parameters or possibilities, I guess, if we're talking about probabilities. So the graph, when we look at a uniform distribution, that's going to be just more like a rectangle, like half of a rectangle. So we're going to see, expected, that's what we're looking for. We can say it's a uniform distribution. So, a lot of these things are kind of picky, term-based. You have to understand what they are in order to discuss them, kind of thing. But I want to sort of press pause on that kind of thing and say, let's step back from the material and the terms and think about how we would use this stuff on a day-to-day basis. So, for instance, if we're looking at something where we've got a bunch of data and we want to see what our distribution is, what's the average? Okay, what's the average? What's the mean? Let's calculate a standard deviation. And then let's say, well, with the sample that we have, or this data set that we have, what are the expected outcomes? But one of the things about expected outcomes is they're more hypotheses than they are the data will prove this. I mentioned before that, statistics, science, research does not prove anything, and I know I kind of climb out of my skin whenever I hear somebody say something like that. And I try to, sit on my hands so I don't get all Italian on the thing and start knocking things off the shelves while I talk. No, it's not that at all. But anyway, the whole idea is to come at it with the lack of bias that I talked about a little ways back. And, think of the outcome in a very general arm's length kind of a way, not what we want to prove is this, because then we look at conflicts of interest, and we've talked about things that have gone through, drug trials and all that, is probably an easy place to cite that kind of a thing. So on page 244 of your chapter 6, there's a little side column there that says, is the iPod random shuffle really random? And if you read that section, basically, this is about our perceptions of what random is. And in this case, the perception of Apple's customers prompted them to make a change. Okay, so then it's not really random. So according to Steve Jobs, this is a great quote, we're making it less random to make it feel more random. Which just means we have messed with the algorithm, and now we'll give you that Jedi mind trick that it is random. But I guess the other thing is that it highlights the importance of being open to what the research says, to what the data says. In our line of inquiry as learning design people, instructional design, educators, and all kinds of trainers, public, private sectors, all that. the first thing that we have to say when faced with any problem, and I don't care how emotional you are about the problem, you have to step back from it. In your due time, if it's something personal and you're upset about it, but you need to make a good decision, step back from it and always ask, what does the research say? Seriously, that is the most important place to start with anything and everything. And so now that you've been kind of introduced to a lot of different ways of looking at things, different ways of expressing things, um, different ways of depicting things for sure. I think that you're kind of armed and just a little bit dangerous now because you can stand back and say, what does the research say? So because nobody's born with these statistical analysis skills or these scholarly writing skills, listen, just you have to do the best you can. And the best way to develop these things is to mimic what someone else has done. So, pull a thesis, pull a journal article, and look at the way it starts from the top of that inverted pyramid and, then graduates downward into exactly where, we want the reader to be. And then we talk about things in certain ways, such as using cautious language. Cautious language means this may affect our control group if blah blah blah. But again, we're gonna write that in third person, not first or second. So these little conventions are things that you will need for your projects. And having been on a few committees, that this is the hardest thing. It's not even about the research; it's about understanding how to put it together. And with statistics and analysis kinds of things, nobody ever memorizes this stuff. Nobody walks around. Well, no, if you're pursuing a PhD, you may walk around spouting, formulae and theorems and equations and that kind of stuff. But truly, even then, and on into, as a researcher and a practitioner, I look up things that model what I think I want to do, like a past study, or I look up data tables to get an idea, to get a conceptualization of where I'm going, and what it is that I want to find out. So the questions are, what are you going to measure? And then once you figure out what you're going to measure, then you're going to figure out how to measure it. And again, knowing where to look for the answer is the most important thing you'll ever learn. It's kind of like if you're a business owner, entrepreneur, whatever the case is, having your attorney on speed dial is not the point. Knowing when to call your attorney using that speed dial is the point. Okay, so again, don't get bogged down in the little stuff, but and don't get bogged down by how you feel about a particular issue or a problem. I'll give you an example here. We can't record or assert or argue something that we don't have evidence to back up or know to be true. I do a lot of genealogical research. Probably 80 to 90% of it is historical research. What was going on at the time in this place with these people? What were the conditions, the economic, the social, all that stuff. And a lot of times, I'll see a lot of errors in other people's research, which, I think at the first I was like, oh my gosh, this is going to drive me crazy. But after a while, what I realized was that's okay. That just makes me have to work a little harder as a consumer of information. And sometimes those erroneous things are good because you can say what it's not. But you can't say definitively something is X if you don't have a really good reason to, and that would either be evidence or some sort of a probability that allows you to kind of predict what's going to happen. So I see a lot of people put in just the place where they think the person was buried, but they don't have anything to back it up. And I will take those out of my research records because, number one, I'll find it anyway. And number two, I can't be certain that they were actually, buried in Ohio. Maybe they went to visit someone in New York and died and were buried there. And I had that happen, and it just drove me crazy because I kept seeing people putting in Ohio, Ohio. And after a while, I'm like, well, it's not here. So then when I took that out and just kind of took the idea off the table, I was more open to what the research had to say, so I could entertain ideas outside of what I thought it was. Another situation, my youngest son has an IEP, and he is so hard to figure out. He's been really hard to figure out his whole life. He didn't speak until he was 3, which kind of that speech delay affects the language acquisition, and everything follows. So it's been a constant struggle and adjustment because there's so much developmental processes and changes going on. So dealing with something like ADHD is sort of like a moving target. So, I got to a point a couple of weeks ago where I was just perplexed because what we are doing is not working. And so I fretted for probably about 24 hours, and then I woke up and I said, oh, what does the research say? Wait a minute. I not only have the tools to figure this out, I have the tools and the resources to step away from the personal pain of the situation to answer the research question. So what I did was I went back over probably 6 years of IEP data and grades and standardized testing, which is not an appropriate measure for this student. So it's kind of like it can skew things, which you're going to learn about next chapter. When you have something skewed, you have to interpret it differently. So kind of looking at all that, I was able to stand back from some of the new research that I got and say, oh, wow, this whole time we have been doing everything to treat the ADHD, which is just a symptom of something else going on that we already discovered. We just haven't addressed it. So we're addressing symptoms, but not getting to the root. And so I took this information and made an annotated bibliography for the intervention specialist. And I, did tell him, this is not me trying to tell anybody how to do their jobs, but I think that between all of us, meaning all of us teachers, we have a lot of training, and I think we can put our heads together. But let me share with you some new observations. And he was just like, wow, that is exactly what we've been looking for. And so, being able to stand back and say, what does the research say, is one thing. So now, we can take that information and take all the data and quantitatively and qualitatively analyze what strategies we need to adjust, or what strategies were working before that have been adjusted, and say, he's got support in 2 of 8 classes, whereas before he had support in 6 of 8 classes, that kind of thing. So everything that you're learning in this class has to be brought into your daily life. You have to have these things sort of pop into your head, especially when you're watching the news. If you watch TV, I try to avoid it, but especially like the Sunday politics shows, people throw around statistics all over the board. Everyone does it. Everyone does it. And I sit there and it scrambles my brains because, first of all, I'm saying, according to whom? You give me a citation. I got to go look that up because maybe that is something I need to know about. That, and of course, it doesn't work that way on live TV. But the other thing is, after according to whom is, well, wait a minute, how big was the study? Is this a poll? Because, polls are not all that they're cracked up to be. And, then I start having all these statistical arguments with myself, and I miss the point of, the journalistic entertainment, whatever you would call it. So anyway, you may just kind of ruin some things for yourself if you get really interested in this stuff. But I do think that we have to. And I think um, the the problem that Erica brought up on the FAQs about the unavailability of data, um, this is another thing that I dealt with. It was a week and a half ago. Somebody asked me a question about a real estate pocket listing, which is just basically a private listing where nobody knows about it. And, I looked at all the data from everywhere. And of course, the thing that's difficult about these kinds of things is that, first of all, the seller agent is the same as the buyer agent. It's not in the MLS, which reduces the likelihood that they will get full exposure, and the probability thereby is reduced that they will sell the house within, say 90 days. But I couldn't really say that because there was an unavailability of data in these pocket listings. So it's not like you can go into the MLS and check, a property that was sold without being listed, no sign in the yard, that kind of thing. So the answer that I gave them was probably, the best possible answer, but did not satisfy me at all. So okay, now what's the effect of the data not being in the MLS? Well, the effect of the data not being in the MLS is that the data in the MLS, while it's a really big sample, will to some degree, we'll call that X, be affected by the lack of data. So therefore, appraisals get skewed. I mean, is this a big problem? Well, maybe not. I think it depends on the area. Do you have enough data to make a good decision? So what I told the person was to talk with the realtor and ask them for data. um, you got to be that guy. You got to ask all the questions and say, okay, what is the average number of days your MLS listings are on the market? What percentage of the price asked did you get? And did you represent the buyer and the seller or one or the other? And then, ask for the same data for their pocket listings. So big red flags go up because, you've already reduced probabilities on that side, but just by nature, they're secret. Okay, so what kind of agreement is this person bound to that they can't disclose that kind of stuff? Because I would kind of expect that, right? So again, then you run into a brick wall and you can't get the data. So how does this person make an informed decision? My next thing was, okay, so you can't get the data. Ask if you can sign a confidentiality agreement so you can see the data. And that may or may not fly. I think it's kind of an outside chance that it would fly, but nonetheless, the person, the realtor who's trying to sell this pocket listing to this seller for their house listing needs to give them something to make a good decision. It's not like it's an imperative that they have this as a pocket listing. It's a desire, and the people who are selling the house are like, yeah, I want to protect my privacy. So that's all well and good as long as you understand it may, cautious language, take you longer to sell your house. You may not get what you're asking, or even as much if you had listed on the MLS. And again, now we can have data that we could plug into all of those things to say, okay, is this true or not? In other words, do MLS listings do better than non-MLS or pocket listings? So, there's ways that we can extrapolate things, but we're not going to be able to get our hands on the data. So, short of having someone who can look into a crystal ball or, read tea leaves or whatever special power it would take to predict the future, probability models are definitely our best um, way to go about what we need to do. So the problem that can arise from this kind of thing is people feel weird asking questions. And I think we've gotten to a point where perhaps maybe our grandparents, never questioned the doctor. But now we ask a lot of questions, and that's okay because, we're encouraged by everyone to participate in our health. So asking questions is one thing, but coming to your doctor and not being armed with, citations, names of articles and, journal citations and all those sorts of things, even URLs, and trying to make a recommendation that you're not qualified to make won't go over well. So just be careful about, after you learn these new superpowers, use them for good and not nefarious. But it does kind of give you now a little higher obligation to yourself, because once you know, you know. So there's a happy medium there to know whether or not to ask the question. And the whole, underlying current of everything we're doing in this class is to say, okay, well, what would we expect under these conditions to happen? And so this helps us minimize risk. It helps us protect our homes and our families, and from an insurance perspective, to understand actuarial tables and probability models and all those things. To our investments, there's a lot more required today than there was when I was 22 and opening my first 401k that's now an IRA. The complexity has increased, and you could probably attribute that to a lot of things. The data's out there, the research says. But understanding how to apply some of these things that we're learning can help you also look at performance charts, for stocks, for bonds, for whatever it is. You can have a little bit more of an understanding. Just be careful with all of these things, not to get bogged down in the weeds. And I know I kind of keep bringing you back to the really, really general, but it's very easy, once we learn a couple of these things, to think everything is that. If I'm, a preschooler and I learn about zebras, pretty soon everything I see looks like a zebra. Hey, that's a zebra. That's a zebra. Hey, is that a zebra? Because I'm thinking of zebras. So be careful, that you don't make a snap judgment without considering what the diagram says, what the tool says, what the parameters are, what the general rules are for interpreting something like what it is that you're looking at. What is the level of statistical literacy that you need to do these things? Well, honestly, again, you need to just be able to go back to your book or go out on the internet and say, how do I figure this out? So, for example, a little bit down the road here, we're going to talk about samples and different types of sampling distribution and estimating and those kinds of things. You want to have some idea, of how that new product is going to go over. So you have some test groups, some trials. But if you have 25 people in one trial and only 21 in the other one, you can't compare those two things evenly. So just knowing that right off the bat, allows you to say, okay, well, I'm not going to use a simple normal distribution type of approach here. What I'm going to do is make sure I have the right high-level view of what it is that I want to measure, how I want to measure it, and then know that these two things aren't apples and apples. So then that branches my thought off into non-parametric statistics, okay? You don't have to know non-parametric statistics yet, but it's just the concept of, make sure that you take everything into account. What are all the possibilities? And then you say, okay, well, if these are all the possibilities that I can come up with, then which ones can I throw out? And you start eliminating those. And then, you come down to your last few. Okay, so these are the possibilities. So just like in project management, these things are more likely to happen, and therefore we might identify these things as risks. So there we go again, calculating risk. But, as a project team, we have to decide whether we're going to accept or mitigate or reject that level of risk. So, there's a high level of risk, say, in the contract that you gave me and want me to sign. So I reject that contract and I send you back one that's a whole lot simpler and way more plain speak, and you sign that. It's good, it's cool. So I had to decide, first of all, is this something that I would not rule out and keep in as a potential risk? And then I had to decide, okay, well, what do I do with it? What is this that I'm looking at, and what decision processes go into deciding, what I should do with this risk? So, I don't mean to bounce all over the place, but these things that you're learning are particularly powerful. It's kind of like a good book that you have to make sure you read the whole thing. You read until the end, not until, just the good part. And sometimes, the urge to finish the book leads us to overlook things. So keep all that in mind. Everything takes longer than you think it will in life. And I think that is perceptual. So back to the whole perception thing. And though it takes us a little bit longer to get through this material sometimes, the most important thing to do is to complete the loop and make sure that you do understand the ways in which distributions differ and how it is that you can correctly analyze them, as opposed to looking at, I guess, a binomial versus, a normal distribution, and saying, okay, well, I've got to do something different with my analysis of the binomial. Okay, already, that is perfect. That's wonderful. That's exactly where you want to be. So understanding, the difference between normal distributions and non-standard normal distributions, and different types, uniform distribution, sampling, splitting those hairs and saying, okay, well, it's not that, it's not that, it's not that. This is how we use what we learn in these courses all the time. When you put together your projects for your master's, you're going to have a lot of writing. The structure of the thing is the structure of the thing. And, I would suggest that you go out and look at the handbook now for your program, and just kind of check out what the requirements are. And then come back to this class, right now, I'm just saying, dip your toe in the water out there and see what it says in the handbook. And then come back to this class. Don't spend too much time out there in the wild. And think about, what it is that you're learning here that can be helpful. What do you plan to do in your project? What types of things interest you? And what kind of a contribution can you make, to the research? What will be your contribution? Now, with master students, you don't have to worry about having a contribution that's new. PhD students, yeah, we had to. And it's very funny to me that when I asked a question that hadn't been researched before, I would get knee deep in it and say, oh, yeah, boy, do I understand now why nobody's done this before. It's a pain in the neck, or, it's impossible, or whatever the case is. So, in my case, for my dissertation, what I ended up with was descriptive statistics, which really irked me. I really, really wanted to get to the inferentials, the predictions and the probabilities, and I just didn't have any data because nobody had looked at the problems before. Interestingly, now my topic is a hot topic, but we'll have to talk about that another time. So, in the meantime, make sure that you understand all of your deadlines and any changes, and do make sure that you do look at the objectives, and make sure that you can at least know where to look. If you can't do it right off the top of your head, you know. Say, for instance, using continuous uniform distributions to find probability. Can you envision how to start that? Can you envision where to look? These are the kinds of things that you want to think about in terms of retention. So, as always, keep up the good work.